Risk is inherent in all projects. The key to project success is to identify risk and then deal with it. Doing this requires a project manager to identify as many risks as possible, categorize those risks, and then develop a contingency plan to deal with each risk. Project plans should always contain a risk analysis. Project risk is defined as an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on a project objective. As implied in the definition, the source of risk is uncertainty. While uncertainty may, in some cases, be internal to the project, the greatest source of uncertainty is in external context, everything outside of the project. Risk management is defined as the systematic process of identifying, analyzing, and responding to project risk. Generally, risk management consists of risk assessment, evaluating the risks, and risk control, acting to avoid, lessen, or prevent the risk. The sub-processes of risk assessment include risk acknowledgement, risk identification, risk analysis, and risk prioritization. The sub-processes of risk control include risk management planning, risk resolution, and risk monitoring. It is useful to distinguish between two categories of risks, known risks and unknown risks. Those risks that have been identified and analyzed can be classified as known risks. It is possible to manage known risks. Within this category of known risks are two risk subtypes. Risks that are opportunities. Some risks represent opportunities for the project. Such risks are favorable and may be pursued to the benefit of the project's objectives. Risks that are threats. Some risks represent threats to the project. Such risks are unfavorable but may be accepted if they are in balance with the reward that may be gained by taking the risk. All other risks that have not been identified and analyzed can be classified as unknown risks. Unknown risks cannot be managed. Such risks are often addressed by applying a general contingency margin, for example, schedule margin, budget margin, based on past experience with similar projects. The process of deciding how to approach and plan the risk management activities for a project is called risk management planning. The appropriate amount of risk management planning will be determined by considering the nature of the risk and the importance of the project. For example, a project involving life-threatening risk, for example, a manned space launch, requires a higher level of risk management planning. Similarly, an information technology project of critical importance to the organization's ability to continue to conduct operations, i.e., a mission-critical project, will require a higher level of risk management planning. Risk management planning attempts to determine the level, type, and visibility of a risk management activity based on the nature of the risk and the importance of the project. Risk management activities must be planned to occur throughout the project. The risk management plan is a subcomponent of the overall project plan. The risk management plan describes the overall approach to managing risk. It describes a process by which risks will be identified, analyzed, monitored, and controlled. Risk identification involves determining which risks might affect the project and documenting their characteristics. Risk identification is an iterative process, usually performed by the project team. In some cases, the process may be performed by a dedicated risk management team. The primary output of the risk identification process is a listing of possible project risk. For ease of risk planning and control, identified risks should be sorted into risk categories. Such categories should reflect common sources of risk for the industry or application area. Risk categories and some associated project risks might include technical risk, performance risk, project management risk, organizational risks, and external risks. Another output of the risk identification process is a set of triggers. These are sometimes called risk symptoms or warning signs. They are an indication that a risk has occurred or is about to occur. Examples of risk triggers would be failure to meet an important project milestone, a significant budget overrun, or loss of a key resource. Tools that may be employed in the risk identification process include documentation reviews, brainstorming, Delphi technique, interviewing, assumption analysis, and system-level diagrams. Qualitative risk analysis is defined as the process of assessing the impact and likelihood of identified risks. As implied by this definition, each specific risk event has two dimensions: the risk impact, sometimes called consequences, and the risk's likelihood of occurrence, risk probability. Risk impact is the effect on project objectives if the risk event occurs. Risk impact is typically measured on a risk impact scale. Such scales may be ordinal scales in order according to ranks such as low, medium, high, or they may be cardinal scales, having values such as 1, 2, 3. Decisions about how risk impact will be measured need to be made as early as possible during the project life cycle. A risk impact rating matrix is a very effective way to describe the different levels of risk as they apply to specific project objectives. Risk probability, the probability of the risk occurring, is usually measured on a scale which ranges between 0 impossibility and 1 certainty. Risk probabilities are also sometimes expressed as a percentage, with 0% being impossibility and 100% being certainty. Risk probabilities are typically difficult to establish with any precision. Experience with similar projects, experience with similar risk events, expert judgment, lessons learned documents, and historical data can all be useful in establishing more accurate risk probabilities. By multiplying the numerical risk impact rating, usually a cardinal scale of 0 to 1 for impact severity, and the risk probability, a cardinal number from 0 to 1 expressing the likelihood that the risk will occur, the risk score for a specific risk can be calculated. The risk scoring matrix shown here demonstrates values for probability, risk impact, and the calculated risk scores. It also illustrates the assignment of a risk category, low, medium, high, based on the numeric value of the calculated risk. Risk scores should be determined for all of the risks identified during the risk identification process. Assumptions that have been made, such as availability of funding by a certain date or availability of a key resource, present a significant source of risk in projects. Therefore, an important aspect of qualitative risk analysis is the testing of project assumptions. Assumptions must be tested in 2 dimensions: testing the stability of the assumptions, the probability that the assumption will continue to be true over an extended period of time, and determining the consequences if the assumption later proves to be true or false. For each assumption being tested, alternative assumptions that may be true should be identified. The alternative assumptions should be evaluated in terms of their consequences for the project if they are later determined to be true. As an example of the impact which assumptions can have, consider the International Space Station program. The program was launched in 1984 with the assumption that congressional support and funding would be continuously available as planned over the 15-plus year life cycle of the program. However, the assumption regarding long-term availability of congressional funding and support later proved to be false. There are many different types of risk, such as technical risk, cost risk, schedule risk, performance risk, marketing risk, and financial risk. The financial consequences of a given risk occurring is known as risk exposure. There is a risk exposure associated with each type of risk. The total project risk exposure can be calculated by summing the risk exposures for all risk types. To calculate the risk exposure for a specific risk type, it is necessary to first estimate 2 factors: risk probability, what is the probability expressed on a scale of 0 to 1 that the risk will occur, and risk impact, what are the financial consequences expressed in dollars if the risk occurs. Using these 2 factors, the risk exposure in dollars for any risk type can be calculated. As a specific example of calculating the risk exposure for marketing, consider the following. If the risk probability of marketing was estimated at 0.1 and the risk impact of marketing was estimated to be $500,000, then the marketing risk exposure, $50,000, would be calculated as you can see. The risk exposure for each identified risk must be calculated in this manner. The total project risk exposure expressed in dollars can then be calculated by summing the risk exposures across all risk types. When a decision maker is faced with several alternatives and an uncertain or risk-filled future, an approach called decision analysis can be used to determine optimal strategies. When the number of outcomes is reasonably small, a technique known as a decision tree can be used to guide decision making. As an example, consider the decision of whether to go to the movies or stay home and watch TV. Risk response planning seeks to develop an agreed-upon risk response for each identified risk and to identify individuals to take ongoing responsibility for managing the risk. Several possible risk response strategies are available: avoidance, transference, mitigation, and acceptance. Both primary and backup strategies may be needed for each identified risk. Risk avoidance involves eliminating a risk or protecting the project objectives from the impact of the risk. Risk transfer seeks to transfer risk to another party and to give the other party the responsibility for the risk response. In the context of project management, risk mitigation may involve various actions to reduce the impact if a specific risk should occur. Risk acceptance involves a decision to leave the project plan unchanged and not to implement any risk avoidance, transference, or mitigation strategies with respect to a specific risk. The primary output of the risk response planning process is a formal risk response plan. This plan should be written in sufficient detail that it clearly specifies what actions are to be taken, when the action should be taken, and by whom the action should be taken. The risk response plan should include identified risks, risk responsibilities, risk analyses, and risk responses. Understanding project risk is a key component of project planning. It's important to understand that there are many categories of risks: business, environment, product, employee, etc. A variety of tools can be used to assist in the identification of risks. Once all risks are identified, assessed in terms of probability and impact, a contingency plan can be developed to mitigate the specific risk. A risk plan should not be developed and filed away. Risks must be actively monitored if they are to be successfully controlled.